there's always been the belief in American journalism that journalists and reporters should strive to be neutral observers of whatever event they are reporting on or whatever issue that they're covering. The assumption is that journalists should set aside their own values, their own biases, and just report on the facts of a particular story, and not include any subjective bias in their account. Now, a big question for us is whether or not that actually happens when we read reports and articles by journalists. Can we indeed say that they are neutral, objective, accurate? And there are a lot of critics and analysts who argue that this idea of objectivity is a real sham, and it's really deceptive. These scholars argue that as human beings, we are inherently subjective, that when we open our eyes, when we observe our surroundings, we're not some cold, rational robot or computer. We make use of our senses to subjectively understand our environment. All right, we subjectively make sense of what's going on around us. And journalists and reporters, regardless of what you may think, are human beings as well. And that when they cover a story, they are going to rely on their human senses and provide a very subjective account of what they see, hear, and experience. So I think a big question is, how does this subjective interpretation of events by the journalist affect how he or she reports on a story? And I think there's a broader question, which is, how does the structure of the news business and American journalism and news organizations, how does the structure of those organizations subjectively shape the way in which news is covered? And here, some scholars argue that there's a structural bias to the news, because the way that news organizations are organized, you have reporters and journalists that wind up getting a good deal of their information from sources that are in positions of authority. All right, so for instance, the journalist that covers the crime beat, all right, and covers stories about crime in a city, that reporter is going to rely on information provided by the police, the law enforcement officials in that city. All right, and when you do that, it provides a structural bias to the information that you're getting, because you wind up reporting on that crime from the vantage point of people in positions of authority. You're getting an account of what happened from the detective or the police captain or sergeant or whoever. All right, so that some critics argue that when journalists cover stories in that way, it systematically biases the story towards the view of those that are in positions of power in a particular institution. We get the view of crime from the vantage point of the police. And the same is true of government, for instance. For reporters and journalists that are covering what's going on in Washington, D.C., or in a particular state capital, the reporter gets a lot of his or her information from that government agency, from that press agent, from this or that government official. And once again, that systematically biases the information towards the vantage point of that government agency or institution. That we get a sense of events that are very much in line with how that government agency or organization wants to spin events, right? Now, apart from this idea that American journalists should be objective and neutral observers, some scholars look a little bit deeper into the ways in which certain subjective values skew news and information presented by American journalists. And one really well-known scholar, Herbert Gans, he did this really extensive study on American news organizations and the content of stories produced by these organizations. And what he did was examine how there were certain underlying values or ideas that shaped the way that news was covered in newspapers and other news media more generally. This part of the chapter identifies 4 particular values. And Gans argued that whenever you would read a story in the New York Times or even on TV news, you'd see these kind of values shape the way in which the story was represented. The first is this idea of ethnocentrism, right? Which, just to put very briefly, is the idea that America is the best country in the world, that the United States is the force of moral righteousness and freedom and democracy throughout the world. Gans argued that in any news coverage of international affairs, there would be this ethnocentric bias where the journalists would assume that in any kind of international dispute, Americans were right and the other countries were wrong. And that Americans were always on the side of democracy, freedom, and liberty, whereas other countries were, terrorists, incompetent, inept, corrupt dictators, right? So ethnocentrism, the idea of America as the best country ever. Another theme that Gans noticed in news coverage was this idea of responsible capitalism. This is the idea that business is good and that business owners and leaders are moral, upstanding citizens that are trying to do the best that they can for their local community and society. This theme in news coverage, responsible capitalism, tended to represent businesses as really moral, really looking out for the public interest, trying to do the best job they can for the American consumer, and so on. Right. So again, responsible capitalism is the idea that business is good and business leaders are really responsible citizens of society. Another value was this idea of small town pastoralism. This has been a theme that tends to present small town, rural America as superior to urban big city areas. Gans noticed that in a lot of news coverage, journalists would present stories about smaller rural towns as being middle America, as being made up of people that were really hardworking and morally upstanding and just all around good people. In contrast to that, a lot of times Gans argued that whenever journalists or reporters would cover stories about urban areas like New York City or Boston, the stories would have a very gritty tone, focusing on the dark side of urban life and how there's lots of crime and grittiness, and how people tend to be kind of really deceptive and unethical. So in essence, this idea of small town pastoralism presented rural, small town life as good, urban, big city life as very questionable and morally suspect. The last subjective value that Gans noticed that popped up a lot in news coverage was this idea of individualism. This is the idea that every individual is responsible for their own destiny, that a person can be successful through their own hard work and determination and perseverance. And the flip side is that people that are poor or impoverished or are unemployed or homeless, they have only themselves to blame just because they're lazy or they haven't worked hard enough. Right? So individualism, again, the idea that we control our own destiny. Now, Gans thought that this value of individualism was kind of interesting because it really ignored broader social forces that may shape our lives in ways that we don't have control over. So, for instance, a story of somebody on welfare or on food stamps might point to how the person was really lazy or didn't work hard, and really ignore what was going on in the economy more generally. That there might be systematic shifts in the economy, growing rates of unemployment due to an economic downturn, and that somebody might be unemployed and then on food stamps, not because they're lazy, but because of these broader economic forces and structures. And Gans argued that reporters would really ignore that a lot, that they would only really focus on, the individual efforts of this or that person. So it's interesting to think about the way in which certain underlying values shape the content of American journalism. And I think it's an interesting question to think about. Can you think of other values that you notice that reoccur a lot in news coverage of current events?